Hello, lifters, and welcome to episode number 18 of Raising the Bar. Today, we are going to dive into the strategies and the methods behind cutting weight while being able to maintain your strength as a powerlifting athlete. But before we dive into that, I do want to let you know that at the end of this podcast, I am going to be sharing information on how one lucky listener can win a free lift review. So make sure that you listen all the way to the end. That way you can get the details. There's a couple different things that you want to take into consideration before you do make the decision to drop into a lower weight class. One of the main questions that you need to ask yourself is whether or not you're going to gain a competitive advantage by dropping weight. So what would a competitive advantage look like? It's really dependent on your goals that you have set for your meet. If you are wanting to get a national qualifying total, for example, you need to make sure that you are doing your research and not only looking at the weight class that you think you want to be in and what the total requirement is there, but also look at the weight class that you're currently in and see what the total requirement is for the higher weight class. Oftentimes, the lower weight class will sometimes have a higher qualifying total than the weight class above it. Same thing for state records and American records. If you are chasing after an American record, sometimes the records for the higher weight classes are lower than the lower weight classes. So you want to make sure that you're looking at all of those things. You never want to put yourself into a position where you are, losing body weight and potentially sacrificing strength in order to have to lift more weight. That's just a terrible position to be in. So if you don't have to, don't do it. And that's kind of my theory on cutting weight in general for competitions. If it does not give you a competitive advantage, it's not worth doing. Another thing that you want to consider, when you're thinking about whether or not it's going to be smart for you to cut your weight, is to look at the weight class within the federation that you are wanting to lift with. Where do you fall within that weight class? And then take a look at some of the other federations' weight classes. Of course, there's, little consistency between the federations because they all like to be a little bit different. So weight classes are no exception. So within one federation, you may be at a less competitive spot, but if you look at a different federation and the way that their weight classes are designed, it may put you in a more competitive spot without having to adjust your weight or sacrifice your strength. So you want to take a look at that. And I will use myself because I'm a prime example of this. So I lift with two different federations, USAPL and USPA. Now, both of those have different weight classes. When I compete with USAPL, I compete in the 72 kilogram class. When I compete with USPA, I compete at the 75 kilogram weight class. And even though there's such a small difference between the two, with one, I'm way more competitive without having to cut weight. With the other, I have to cut a little bit of weight in order for me to be on the competitive side and have that advantage. So with USAPL, for example, I compete in the 72 kilogram weight class. The heaviest you can be within 72 kilograms is 158.5 pounds. I naturally sit right around 163 to 165. Like that's my body's happy place. So when I compete with PL, I do need to, drop somewhere between 5 and 8 pounds in order to get into that competitive spot. And the reason why that makes more sense for me is with PL, the higher your body weight and the higher those weight classes go, the bigger range within those weight classes you have. So if I'm competing at 163 with USAPL and that's 84 kilogram weight class, I am competing against women that are potentially up to 185 pounds. That is a massive swing. Now, if I drop that 5 to 8 pounds, I am now at the higher end of a lower weight class, which gives me a competitive advantage. Now with USPA, the top weight within the 75 kilogram weight class is 165 pounds, which is perfect. I don't have to cut weight for that. I can stay at my current body weight, which is somewhere between 163 and 165. I will definitely be, watching what I eat and make sure that I am, staying on point. That way I don't bump up, but I don't have to drop weight for that. So I'm just already in a more competitive spot without having to make any type of adjustments. So now that we've looked into all the different weight classes for the different federations, we've looked at whether or not dropping weight is going to give us a competitive advantage. And we've decided, yes, dropping weight is going to give me as the lifter a competitive advantage. Now, how the heck do we drop weight without sacrificing our strength? There are two really big mistakes that get made when trying to accomplish this goal. Mistake number one is cutting all of the weight too early in the prep and having to maintain that low body weight throughout the duration of the prep, which is going to allow fatigue to set in. Mistake number two is the complete opposite, is waiting to the last minute to cut all of the weight at one time. Neither of those situations are going to set you up for success for your meet, and you are absolutely going to sacrifice strength in both of those scenarios. So the trick here is to maintain a consistent, very slight caloric deficit over the course of the prep. Now, when I say caloric deficit, I don't mean that we need to be at a deficit every single day. Because as we know, one day of really good eating and one day of bad eating is not really going to make a big difference in the grand scheme of things over the course of 12 or 16 weeks. However, we do need to look at the caloric intake over the course of 7 days. So when I am calculating macros and meal plans for my competitive athletes, I don't just look at the calories needed for the day, because clearly the body is going to require higher calories on a very, very heavy leg day versus a rest day, right? The requirements for the body are going to be significantly different. So, on those really intense training session days, I'm probably going to bump the caloric intake up just a little bit. On the rest days, I'm going to reduce it. Now, if I had my lifter at that heavy leg day every single day, it's probably going to put them at a caloric surplus. However, when I take the average of the entire week compared to what the body requires, that is when we're going to see the slight caloric deficit. So the slow and steady wins the race approach is really the best way to do this. It's going to ensure that the athlete is going to have adequate amounts of energy and not feel fatigued throughout the duration of the prep. And it's also going to ensure that they don't have to do some ridiculous, intense caloric cut at the very end and add in all this other cardio and do all this other nonsense in order to make the weight class. If you get to the end of your prep and you're still not where you need to be, don't try anything drastic. Just don't. It's not the end of the world if you do need to compete in that higher weight class, and you're probably going to perform better if you just refeed yourself and stick with that higher weight class than trying to force your body into a situation that it clearly doesn't want to go. So there's very few situations in which I will take an athlete through a more drastic cut towards so close to the competition date. And typically I will only do this for athletes that have done this to their body many times over and know exactly how their performance is going to be impacted as a result. So typically these are higher level athletes. And when this is a situation, they typically aren't too far off from their competitive weight to begin with. With male athletes, somewhere within 8 to 10 pounds, you'll implement a water cut towards the end, and that's going to do the trick to get them into that lower weight class. With women, I leave that buffer a little bit smaller, usually around 5 to 7 pounds within that weight class. But like I said, slow and steady is really the best option if you have never cut weight for a competition before. And even if you have, I still, in general, I still think that's the best option for you, because you have more control over the variables and have more control over the outcome and are less likely to sacrifice performance in order to hit that weight. So a couple things that I want you to take away from the conversation today. One, to take a look at all of the federations and see which weight classes are going to make sense for you. If you can find a federation that you are in the best place within a weight class and do not have to manipulate your weight, I highly recommend lifting with that federation. If for some reason you can't do that and you want to lift with a different federation, or you need to lift with a different federation, you want to determine whether or not dropping weight is going to give you a competitive advantage. If it does, do it the right way. If it doesn't, don't do it. There's no need. And then the final thing is just make sure that you have a overarching game plan for the entire process. There is, a little bit of guesswork involved, especially if you, like I said, if you're new to doing all of this, if you're new to working with me as your coach, I need to figure out your body, right? I need to know how it's going to react to certain things. And that takes a little bit of time. just like you, if you're starting this process, you don't necessarily know how your body's going to react to it. So there's a little bit of testing that needs to come into place. So you want to make sure to give yourself a buffer for that. I hope you found value in today's episode. If you did, please subscribe and share with your fellow lifters. In the beginning of this podcast episode, I did say that I was giving away something for free. So I am giving away to one special listener a free lift review. Now, on that lift review, I'm going to analyze one barbell lift of your choice. And I'm going to break down any inefficiencies you may have, identify weak points in your lift, identify mobility restrictions, and then I am going to give you 3 drills to take back into the gym to work on, to improve on those areas, and ultimately help you add weight to your barbell. So in order to get in the running to win the free lift review, you need to do 3 things. 1, you need to leave a review on this podcast. 2, you need to send me a screenshot of your review. And 3, you need to send it to me in a DM on Instagram. I will make sure to leave my Instagram contact info in the notes of this podcast. But otherwise, I will talk to you next Wednesday on episode number 19 of Raising the Bar.